On April 12, 1552, a 15-year-old king caught the measles. Within 2 weeks, he recovered completely. 14 months later, on July 6, 1553, he was dead. When the royal surgeon opened his chest, he found nothing but rotting holes where healthy lungs should have been. The tissue had quite literally decayed inside his living body. This is the story of Edward VI, and what happened in those 14 months remains one of the most disturbing medical declines ever documented in royal history. What makes it even more chilling is that we know almost everything. An imperial ambassador stationed at the English court had a medical student feeding him daily reports from inside the palace walls. We have records of the color of the king's sputum. We know when his legs began to swell. We know the exact hour his breathing changed. We have more detailed accounts of Edward's death than almost any other medieval monarch, and what those accounts reveal is genuinely horrifying. Edward VI was the son Henry VIII had torn apart the Catholic Church to have. He was the heir that cost Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard their heads. His mother, Jane Seymour, died 12 days after giving birth to him. This boy was the most protected, most precious child in all of England. He was raised in chambers that were scrubbed twice daily. He was isolated from anyone who might carry illness. Physicians monitored his every meal. His food was prepared under the strictest supervision. When outbreaks of plague or sweating sickness hit London, Edward was immediately moved to the countryside. If anyone at court showed even the slightest sign of sickness, they were removed from his presence without question. This wasn't paranoia. This was royal policy. Edward was the only legitimate male heir to the Tudor throne. If he died, everything Henry had fought for would collapse into uncertainty. And for 15 years, it worked. Edward was rarely sick. Aside from a serious bout of malaria at age 4, from which he fully recovered, the boy thrived. Contemporary accounts describe him as well-fed, handsome, and remarkably tall for his age. He could ride, he could hunt. He participated in mock jousts. He was an active, athletic teenager with every reason to expect a long and prosperous reign. Then came April of 1552. Edward caught measles. He may have also contracted smallpox around the same time, though historians still debate this. Either way, he was violently ill for about 2 weeks. Then, just as suddenly as it had struck, the illness seemed to pass. By May, Edward was back to his normal activities. He appeared to have recovered completely. But here's what nobody in 1552 could have possibly understood. The measles virus doesn't just make you sick and then leave. It systematically suppresses your immune system's ability to fight tuberculosis. Modern medical research has documented this phenomenon extensively. Measles essentially resets your body's defenses against TB. If Edward had been exposed to tuberculosis before that spring, if he carried even a dormant infection somewhere deep in his lungs, the measles would have knocked down the very immune responses keeping it under control. The clock had started ticking. Edward just didn't know it yet. Through the summer and fall of 1552, Edward appeared to return to normal court life, but those closest to him began to notice subtle changes. He seemed weaker than before. His stamina had declined. He was forced to cancel a planned royal progress through southern England, a journey that should have been a triumphant display of the young king's health and authority. His complexion remained unnaturally pale. He appeared exhausted even after moderate activity. By September, Edward's physicians began to suspect something was deeply wrong with his lungs. They couldn't identify tuberculosis because the bacteria responsible wouldn't be discovered for another 3 centuries. But they recognized the signs. A persistent cough was beginning to emerge. Fevers came and went without explanation. These were the characteristic symptoms of what they called consumption. Edward himself continued his official duties. He studied, he attended council meetings, he participated in elaborate court ceremonies. But his capacity was visibly diminishing, and the people around him could see it happening in real time. By December of 1552, there was no hiding it anymore. Edward had a persistent fever that simply wouldn't break. His weakness had progressed to the point where even moving across a room became difficult. He was short of breath even while sitting still, a terrifying symptom for a 15-year-old boy. And the cough had become constant, deep, racking, impossible to ignore. What made it far worse was what he was coughing up. The imperial ambassador's medical informant, a student named John Bannister, recorded the details with clinical precision. Sometimes the sputum was greenish-yellow, sometimes it was black, sometimes it was pink with streaks of blood. Each color told a different story of what was happening inside the king's body. Greenish-yellow meant active infection. Black suggested dead tissue breaking apart. Pink meant the infection had begun eating through blood vessels in his lungs. Edward was intelligent enough to understand exactly what was happening to him. At 15, he had already ruled England for 6 years. He had sat through countless council meetings. He had read extensively on matters of state and theology. He knew that consumption was a killer. He knew it had already taken members of his own family. As January of 1553 began, this teenage king started preparing not for recovery, but for death. And what he chose to focus on wasn't his own survival. It was something far more dangerous. The succession. In early February of 1553, Edward's half-sister Mary came to court. The two had been bitterly estranged for years. Edward was a committed Protestant, genuinely devoted to the Reformed faith. raised by Protestant tutors and surrounded by Protestant advisors who had shaped every aspect of his worldview. Mary was an equally committed Catholic who had refused to abandon her religion despite years of intense pressure during Edward's reign. Their relationship had deteriorated into cold formality. Edward had repeatedly tried to force Mary to convert. She had repeatedly refused, but now Edward was dying, and Mary came to see her younger brother one final time. The visit was not what either of them had hoped. Edward was bedridden during their meeting. He was seized by violent coughing fits that left him gasping and shaking with exhaustion. The physical decline was impossible to ignore now, even for someone who hadn't seen him in months. Mary could see that her brother was dying right in front of her, but even in his weakened state, even as his body failed him, Edward maintained his intellectual sharpness. He discussed religious and political matters with her. He didn't soften his position on her Catholicism. He wasn't seeking reconciliation or comfort. He was still, even now, trying to convert her. It would be their last significant meeting. Within weeks, Mary would leave the capital, anticipating her brother's death and fearing what would come after. In March of 1553, one of the strangest and most disturbing episodes of Edward's illness unfolded. An unknown woman appeared at court claiming she could cure the king. Edward's regular physicians were clearly failing. They couldn't agree on treatment. Nothing they attempted was working. The king was deteriorating despite their best efforts. Into this atmosphere of desperation stepped this mysterious woman, identified in one Italian source only as an Italian gentlewoman, who insisted she possessed a secret remedy. Despite protests from the royal physicians, the Council of State allowed her to attempt treatment. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, appears to have been behind this decision. She refused to reveal her methods in advance. The regular physicians were physically excluded from the room while she worked. What happened next is documented in multiple sources. Edward's condition got dramatically, catastrophically worse. His legs swelled so severely that he couldn't move them without screaming in pain. His general condition deteriorated at an alarming rate. Whatever she was administering was clearly causing harm. She was quickly dismissed, but the damage was done. Historians have debated for centuries what this woman gave Edward. One possibility is mercury, which was widely used in 16th century medicine and is also highly toxic. The symptoms mercury poisoning causes, including dramatic swelling of the extremities, match exactly what was observed in Edward after her treatment. We will never know for certain. But what we do know is that after this woman's intervention, Edward never recovered even to his previous diminished state. He had entered the final, terminal phase. If you're finding this story as haunting as we did researching it, please consider subscribing. History's darkest moments deserve to be remembered, not just for the horror, but for the human beings who lived through them. We tell these stories so they're never forgotten. By early April, Edward had stabilized slightly from the worst of his acute symptoms. His physicians decided to try moving him. If the air at Westminster was corrupted, perhaps the cleaner air downriver at Greenwich would help. On April 11, 1553, Edward traveled by river barge to Greenwich Palace. The next day he appeared briefly in the palace gardens. Crowds immediately gathered. The people of London had heard countless rumors about their young king's health. Some said he was already dead. Others claimed he was recovering and the government was lying. Now here he was, walking in the gardens of Greenwich. Those who actually saw him understood the terrible truth. Contemporary observers noted that Edward was shockingly thin, wasted far beyond what any normal illness should explain. His complexion was ghostly pale. His movements were slow and obviously painful. Everyone who looked at him realized they were watching a dying man, not a recovering one. The fresh river air of Greenwich couldn't reverse what was happening inside his body. His lungs were being consumed from within. His organs were beginning to fail one by one. No change of scenery could stop it. By mid-May, the physician's assessment shifted from hopeful to terminal. Their diagnosis was a suppurating tumor of the lung, essentially a massive abscess, a collection of infected pus within the lung tissue itself. The infection had created pockets of decay inside his living body. The symptoms were now overwhelming. A constant, racking cough dominated his existence. High fever never fully broke. His belly became severely distended and swollen. Signs that the infection was spreading and his digestive system was shutting down. His body broke out in ulcers across his skin. He could no longer digest food. What little nutrition he received came from medicinal restoratives and fortified broths. He was dependent on laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, just to sleep through the pain. And yet somehow, impossibly, his mind remained perfectly clear. On May 21, 1553, Edward altered his will. His device for the succession was modified to explicitly name Lady Jane Grey as his preferred heir, ahead of both his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth. This wasn't the confused act of a delirious, dying boy. This was a calculated political decision made by a teenage king who understood exactly what he was doing. Edward knew that Mary would restore Catholicism to England the moment she took power. He had spent his entire reign building a Protestant nation. He wasn't going to let his death undo everything he believed in. The device was controversial and legally questionable. It contradicted Henry VIII's succession acts. It bypassed two adult women with far stronger claims, but Edward was determined. If he was going to die, England would remain Protestant. By the end of May, Edward's decline accelerated at a terrifying pace. He was wasting away visibly, losing weight even though he couldn't eat anything substantial. His body began to swell in disturbing ways, especially his head and his feet. He couldn't rest without opiates, and even then, violent coughing fits would wake him. And there was something else, something the contemporary accounts are delicate about mentioning, but which they make unmistakably clear: the smell. The odor of disease and internal decay was becoming noticeable to everyone attending him. Edward's body was rotting from the inside out, and that process was now detectable to everyone in his chamber. His hair was falling out in clumps. His fingernails were loosening from their beds. These are signs of severe systemic toxicity, his body accumulating waste products that failing kidneys could no longer filter out. On June 10th, Edward's physicians gave him 3 days to live. They were wrong. He would survive another 3.5 weeks, but those weeks would be unimaginable suffering. By mid-June, Edward had given up any hope of recovery. On June 11th and 12th, he couldn't hold anything in his stomach. On June 15th, he was attacked by violent fever that lasted 24 hours. 2 days later, another one struck. His body could barely expel waste, and when it could, contemporary accounts note that it carried a terrible stench, a sign of catastrophic internal infection. His body was poisoning itself, but his mind, somehow, remained sharp. On June 21st, Edward ordered his device for the succession to be authenticated under letters patent, a proper legal document, witnessed and sealed. This was a king's final command. By June 24th, the ambassador reported that Edward could hardly breathe and rarely moved. His body no longer performed normal functions. He was covered in scabs and weeping ulcers. Contemporary accounts are brutally honest. Edward's last days must have been unendurable. He was doing nothing more than waiting for death. On July 1st, 1553, Edward was positioned at a window at Greenwich Palace. A crowd had gathered below, desperate to see their young king after weeks of terrifying rumors. The window opened. Edward appeared. The reaction was immediate horror. The king was so thin and wasted that everyone who saw him understood he was doomed. This wasn't the healthy teenager who had appeared in the gardens months earlier. This was death itself, draped in royal clothing. Edward had shown himself to his people one final time. It was both a gesture of royal authority and an inadvertent farewell. The crowds understood exactly what they were seeing. On July 6, 1553, between 8 and 9 o'clock in the evening, Edward VI died at Greenwich Palace. Before he lost the ability to speak, he prayed. His final prayer was documented by those present. He didn't pray for his own recovery. He didn't ask for more time. He prayed for England. His words were these: "Lord God, deliver me out of this miserable and wretched life, and take me among thy chosen. Howbeit, not my will, but thy will be done. Lord, I commit my spirit to thee. O Lord, thou knowest how happy it were for me to be with thee. Yet for thy chosen sake, send me life and health, that I may truly serve thee. O my Lord God, bless thy people and save thine inheritance. O Lord God, save thy chosen people of England. O my Lord God, defend this realm from papistry and maintain thy true religion." Even in death, Edward's fear was for his kingdom's soul. As his strength gave out, his final words were simply, "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me and take my spirit." Sir Henry Sidney, Edward's closest friend, took the dying king into his arms. Edward VI surrendered his spirit, as Sidney later reported, in great sweetness. He was 15 years old, just 15 days short of his 16th birthday. He had reigned for 6 years. After Edward's death, a court surgeon performed an autopsy. What they found inside his body confirmed the horror everyone had witnessed. Both lungs contained what the surgeon described as putrefied ulcers. Not simple sores, but areas where the lung tissue had literally rotted away while Edward was still alive, still breathing, still conscious. The boy king, who had been the most protected child in England, raised in rooms scrubbed twice daily, shielded from every possible threat, had died from an infection consuming him from within. Sometimes, no amount of protection can save you from what's already hiding inside. What do you think Edward's final prayer reveals about who he really was? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.